"Loitering, huh? What are you doing here?" Officer Derek Coleman's voice cut through the rain, his eyes narrowing at the man hunched under a tattered blanket. The stranger looked up, rain dripping from his brow. His voice was calm, steady. "Sitting," Coleman scoffed. "Got ID?" The man didn't flinch. "Do I need one to sit?" Something about his composure sent a chill down Coleman's spine. The air grew thick with tension, and when he finally realized who he was talking to, his world would never be the same. What would you do if you witnessed someone being unfairly judged? Comment where you're watching from. Like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The city was a place of stark contrasts. Gleaming skyscrapers pierced the sky, their illuminated windows standing as monuments to wealth and success. Below, however, lay a world of starkly different reality. Tucked into alleyways and along abandoned lots, makeshift tent encampments stretched like scars across the urban landscape. Tarps and cardboard served as fragile walls against the biting cold, a daily reminder of the ever-growing wealth disparity. The streets hummed with tension. Headlines spoke of protests erupting just days ago, triggered by police brutality in a neighboring district. Conversations were punctuated by mistrust, a bubbling anger simmering beneath every interaction. The wealthy hurried along, their heads down, avoiding eye contact with those forced to sleep on benches or sidewalks. On the other side, the disenfranchised shared stories of missed opportunities and invisible barriers, their voices growing louder, in unity yet tinged with exhaustion. Underneath it all, there was a fragile silence, one that threatened to crack at the slightest provocation. Even the weather seemed to reflect the city's mood. The rain fell with relentless insistence, washing away nothing but leaving a cold, slick reminder of the struggles no one could ignore. In this environment, even the smallest incident could ignite the flames of division. Amid the quiet tension, the man on the bench remained a solitary figure. His posture was composed, despite the rain soaking through his threadbare clothes. He spoke little, but those who passed often noticed his presence. Some whispered about his sharp eyes, which carried an unspoken depth, and others recalled the faint smile he offered when handing over half of his meager sandwich to someone even hungrier than himself. He seemed to know more than he let on. Once, a young man struggling to fix his broken bicycle approached him in frustration. Without a word, the man rose, examined the chain, and fixed it in minutes. "How'd you know that?" the boy asked, astonished. The man simply shrugged. "Sometimes you figure things out," he said cryptically. At the same time, he was a mystery. He often avoided direct conversations, offering only vague but oddly profound answers to those who pressed. His voice carried a calm authority that didn't match his appearance. Passers-by couldn't help but wonder, who was he? Where had he come from? And why did he seem so out of place in this sea of hardship? These unanswered questions lingered, weaving an air of quiet intrigue around the man as he sat motionless, watching the world move around him. Officer Derek Coleman had built a reputation for being tough but efficient. His crisp uniform and upright demeanor painted the picture of professionalism, but his actions often hinted at something less commendable. To his colleagues, he was a no-nonsense cop who believed in law and order. To those who crossed his path, especially the city's homeless, he was known for his quick judgments and curt dismissals. Derek had his own logic for his biases. "They're all the same," he muttered once during a coffee break. "Drifters, addicts, trouble waiting to happen." He never lingered to listen to their stories or understand their circumstances. To him, a tattered coat and an unkempt appearance were enough to make someone suspicious. His subtle prejudices showed in the little things. Walking past a homeless man, he would avoid eye contact, his steps quickening as if proximity alone might taint him. When speaking to them, his tone was clipped, laced with impatience. "Move along," he would say, rarely waiting for a response. If they lingered too long, his voice sharpened further, his hand already hovering near his radio. Despite his outward professionalism, Coleman's interactions betrayed an underlying discomfort, even hostility. He wasn't overtly cruel, but his dismissal of the homeless as problems to be managed rather than people to be understood defined his approach to the badge he wore. And in his world, there was no room for second chances or hidden depths, until he was forced to confront them. Maria Lopez walked a very different beat. Younger than Coleman by a decade, she approached her role with a quiet empathy that often made her stand out among her peers. Where Derek saw vagrants, Maria saw people. She made an effort to learn names, ask questions and listen without judgment. "Cold night out here," she'd remark gently to someone huddled under a blanket. "You okay? Need anything?" Her warmth often disarmed those who expected hostility. She carried granola bars in her patrol car and handed them out without fanfare. It wasn't much, but it was more than most offered. Maria admired Coleman's experience, but struggled with his approach. She often found herself mediating his harsher judgments, stepping in when his tone became too sharp or his actions too brusque. "Derek, maybe we can handle this differently," she'd suggest, her voice soft but firm. Coleman would wave her, off most of the time, brushing aside her concerns as naivete. Still, Maria couldn't shake the discomfort growing inside her. Each dismissive remark from Coleman, each rough encounter with the city's vulnerable, chipped away at her patience. Deep down, she hoped that one day Derek might see what she saw in the people he judged so harshly, a glimpse of humanity that deserved respect. Have you ever felt like you had to prove your worth to be treated fairly? Have you been in a situation where judgment was passed before anyone knew your story? How did you handle it? Share your experience below, and let's start a conversation. Coleman's boots splashed through the puddles as he closed the distance to the bench. His posture was stiff, his hand resting instinctively near his utility belt. "All right, let's go. You can't stay here all night," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man slowly lifted his head, meeting Coleman's gaze. His face was calm, but his eyes held a depth that was hard to ignore. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said evenly, his voice quiet but steady. Coleman frowned, taking a step closer. "You've been sitting here for hours. People are calling this loitering, and I'm inclined to agree. Stand up. Let's see some ID." "I'm just resting," the man replied. He didn't move from his spot, though his voice remained respectful. "I didn't know sitting was a crime." Coleman's patience wore thin. "Don't play smart with me. Get up or I'll have no choice but to escort you downtown." A few bystanders had stopped nearby, umbrellas shielding them from the rain. Their murmurs were soft at first, but the unease in the air grew palpable. One woman whispered to her companion, "What's he even done?" The man on the bench sighed and stood, moving deliberately. His tattered blanket fell to the ground, revealing clothes that, though old, were clean and well-worn. He spread his hands slightly, a quiet act of compliance. "I don't carry an ID," he said simply. Coleman's jaw tightened. "Then what? Am I supposed to think, huh? No ID, no address, just sitting here looking suspicious." The man tilted his head. "Suspicious of what exactly?" His words carried a quiet challenge, one that unsettled the officer more than he wanted to admit. "You tell me," Coleman snapped. "We've had reports of theft in this area. How do I know you're not the one causing trouble?" "I suppose you don't," the man said with a small shrug. "But accusing someone without evidence, doesn't that go against the badge you wear?" The murmurs from the growing crowd grew louder. A teenager holding a phone lifted it slightly, recording the exchange. Coleman noticed and felt a surge of frustration. His voice grew sharper. "I don't need lectures on how to do my job, either. You come with me willingly, or I'll make you." The man stayed silent for a moment, the rain drumming softly between them. Then, with a calm nod, he said, "If that's what you think is necessary." Maria Lopez appeared from the other side of the park, jogging over quickly. "Derek," she called, her voice firm but measured. "What's going on here?" Coleman didn't look at her, his focus still on the man. "We've got a potential vagrant refusing to cooperate. Looks like we're heading downtown." The man glanced at Lopez, offering her the faintest of smiles. "Potential vagrant," he repeated, his tone almost amused. "Is that what we've come to?" Lopez's brows furrowed as she observed the scene. The unease in her eyes grew, but for now she held her tongue. The tension around them thickened, drawing the crowd even closer, as if they knew this was just the beginning. Coleman adjusted his stance, irritation flashing across his face. "I asked for your ID," he repeated, his tone edging closer to a command. "You're legally required to identify yourself when an officer asks." The man remained calm, his gaze steady. "Am I? Last I checked, sitting on a bench isn't a crime, and I'm not obligated to carry identification." Coleman's jaw clenched. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Am I?" the man said, his voice smooth, almost disarming. "Or are you making it harder by assuming I've done something wrong without any proof?" The subtle defiance in his words cut deeper than Coleman cared to admit. Around them, the crowd grew quieter, their attention fixed on the confrontation. Maria Lopez stepped closer, her expression uneasy, but she didn't interrupt. Coleman straightened, attempting to reassert control. "Listen, I don't have time for games. Either you provide ID, or you're coming with me." The man didn't flinch. "On what grounds? Sitting in public? I don't think that's how the law works." Coleman took a deliberate step closer, the tension palpable. "You think you're smarter than me?" he asked, his voice dropping. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" The man's expression softened, almost pitying. "I'm not trying to outsmart you, officer. I'm simply standing up for my rights. Surely you can respect that." The words struck a nerve. Coleman's hand hovered near his radio, his frustration mounting. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. Most people complied, whether out of fear or desperation. But this man, this infuriatingly calm man, refused to bend. Lopez finally spoke, her voice measured but firm. "Derek, maybe we should take a moment and reassess. He hasn't done anything. He's refusing to cooperate," Coleman snapped, cutting her off. "How am I supposed to do my job if people think they can just ignore the rules?" The man's voice cut through the rising tension, steady as ever. "The rules apply to everyone, officer, don't they?" For a moment Coleman was silent, the weight of the man's words hanging heavy in the air. Around them, the onlookers shifted, their unease turning to quiet murmurs. The power struggle between the two was clear, and Coleman couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he was losing. The crowd around the scene thickened, individuals drawn in by the unmistakable tension. Some stood back, watching cautiously while others edged closer, phones raised to capture the unfolding interaction. The low hum of murmured conversations began to swell, adding another layer of pressure to the charged atmosphere. "I don't see what he's done wrong," a woman in a raincoat whispered to the man next to her. She held an umbrella over her head, but kept glancing nervously toward Coleman. "He's just sitting there." "You don't know the full story," the man replied, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Cops don't just arrest people for no reason." A teenager with headphones slung around his neck raised his phone higher, ensuring the officer and the homeless man were both in the frame. "This is messed up," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They're always hassling people for nothing," not everyone agreed. Near the edge of the group, an older man shook his head, arms crossed. "If he's got nothing to hide, he should just show some ID," he said gruffly. "What's the big deal?" The whispers and occasional raised voices began to create ripples of division. Some onlookers quietly sided with Coleman, nodding at his stern demeanor, while others bristled at what they perceived as unnecessary force. The homeless man, however, stood at the center of it all, unmoving, his calm demeanor strikingly at odds with the chaos forming around him. "I'm recording this," said a woman holding a phone with a bright pink case. Her voice was loud enough to reach Coleman's ears. "This is harassment, plain and simple." Coleman's eyes darted toward her, his irritation visible. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay back and let me do my job." "What job is that exactly?" Another voice chimed in, a man in a baseball cap stepping forward. "Intimidating someone who's done nothing wrong? This is what's wrong with the system." Coleman's grip on his radio tightened as his frustration mounted. "I'm enforcing the law," he barked, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "If you don't like it, you're welcome to step away." The homeless man's voice broke through, low but clear. "Let them watch," he said, glancing at Coleman with an unreadable expression. "Accountability is not a bad thing, is it?" The comment stung, and Coleman's face hardened. "You think this is about me? You're the one refusing to cooperate." Another murmured voice rose from the crowd. "He's refusing because you're treating him like a criminal. You even have proof he did anything?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. "Racial profiling," someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Same thing, different day." Lopez shifted uncomfortably, her eyes scanning the crowd. The division was growing sharper, the voices louder. Each passing second seemed to add fuel to the fire, and yet the man remained unshaken, his composure holding firm as if daring the situation to escalate further. The man stood tall, his soaked clothes clinging to him, but his posture was unyielding. Despite the cold rain and Coleman's sharp tone, he exuded an air of quiet dignity that seemed almost incongruous with his appearance. He looked directly at Coleman, unflinching, his calm presence in stark contrast to the officer's simmering frustration. "You're making a scene," Coleman said, his voice laced with impatience. "If you'd just cooperate, this would all be over." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Over for who, officer? For me, when I give in to your assumptions? Or for you, when you don't have to question why you made them in the first place?" The question landed like a stone in a still pond, its ripples visible in the shifting faces of the crowd. A few murmured softly, their eyes flicking between Coleman and the man. Even Lopez, standing nearby, seemed to pause, her gaze sharpening as if she were seeing something new in the situation. Coleman frowned, his hand tightening around his radio. "Don't try to turn this around on me. You're the one refusing to follow the rules." The man's lips curved into a faint, almost melancholic smile. "Rules are easy to follow when they're fair, officer. But fairness doesn't seem to be the same for everyone, does it?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "That's true," a woman said softly. Another nodded, her phone still pointed at the scene. "He's got a point," the man continued, his voice steady, each word carrying weight. "I've been here for hours, sitting quietly, harming no one. And yet, here we are, with you assuming. I must be doing something wrong. Why is that? Because you look like—" Coleman stopped himself, his words hanging unfinished in the air. The pause was damning, the silence that followed even more so. The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to sharpen, like he was daring Coleman to finish the thought. "Like what, officer?" the man asked gently, his tone devoid of anger but heavy with meaning. "Like someone who doesn't belong." The crowd stirred again, their collective unease now shifting into quiet outrage. Lopez took a half-step forward, her expression conflicted, but she said nothing. For a moment, even Coleman seemed at a loss for words, his authority faltering against the calm, measured strength of the man before him. "You're not making this any easier," Coleman said finally, his voice quieter but still strained. The man met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. "Change never comes easy, officer, but it's necessary, and sometimes it starts with asking yourself why you see someone the way you do." The words hung in the air, resonating not just with Coleman, but with the onlookers, whose murmurs of discontent began to shift into something more profound. For the first time, the man wasn't just a figure on a bench. He was a voice forcing everyone to reconsider what they believed. Coleman's grip on his radio loosened as he glanced toward the man, who stood with unwavering calm, and then at the crowd, their expressions a mix of quiet defiance and curiosity. The scene was slipping out of his control, and he felt it in every uncertain beat of his racing thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be straightforward, a routine interaction that ended with compliance. Yet, here he was, his authority challenged not through aggression, but through quiet, relentless logic. "Derek," Lopez's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but insistent. She stepped closer, her hand lightly brushing his arm. "Maybe we need to step back for a second. He hasn't done anything illegal. Sitting on a bench isn't a crime." Coleman shot her a sharp look, his voice low. "Lopez, we have protocols. If we let people walk all over us, what kind of message does that send?" Lopez didn't back down. Her expression was calm but firm. "What kind of message are we sending now? You heard what he said. What exactly are we accusing him of? Do we even know?" Her words struck a nerve, not because they were accusatory, but because they echoed the questions that had begun forming. In Coleman's own mind, he looked back at the man, who watched them silently, his calm demeanor now feeling less like defiance and more like quiet endurance. For the first time, Coleman hesitated. "This isn't about him cooperating," Lopez added, her tone softer now. "This is about us, about why we're even doing this." Coleman frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, their silent judgment pressing against his confidence. He wasn't used to being questioned, not by the public, not by his peers, and certainly not by himself. Yet, Lopez's words lingered, sowing doubt. He couldn't ignore. The man spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a steady current. "It's not easy to question yourself, officer. But sometimes the hardest questions lead to the most important answers." Coleman looked at him, his frustration warring with something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. For the first time, he didn't respond. He just stood there, grappling with the weight of a moment that felt far bigger than he'd anticipated. The air was heavy, the tension palpable. The rain continued to fall, masking the whispers of the onlookers who now seemed frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Coleman's hand hovered over his radio, his stance rigid, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. His authority, so absolute in most situations, now felt fragile under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny and the man's quiet defiance. "Step back, sir," Coleman barked, his voice sharp enough to silence the murmurs momentarily. The homeless man didn't move, his expression steady and resolute. He wasn't confrontational, but his unwillingness to yield only deepened Coleman's unease. "Officer," Lopez interjected, her voice calm but urgent, "we need to think this through. Escalating won't solve anything." Coleman ignored her, his focus narrowing to the man in front of him. "I'm giving you one last chance to comply," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The man met Coleman's gaze, unflinching. "The harder it gets," he said softly, "the clearer it becomes who's really in control." The words landed heavily, pushing Coleman closer to the edge. The crowd stirred again, their collective unease thickening the air as the moment teetered, on the brink of something irreversible. Systemic bias often operates in ways that are subtle yet deeply ingrained, influencing how people are perceived and treated based on assumptions rather than facts. Do you think this kind of bias played a role in how the events of this story unfolded? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar where prejudice shaped the outcome? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. The station was quieter than usual, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the distant chatter of officers filling the space. Coleman walked in with heavy steps, his jaw clenched as he led the homeless man toward the processing desk. Lopez followed closely, her expression a mix of determination and unease. The crowd outside had dispersed, but their murmurs and phone cameras still lingered in Coleman's mind. As they reached the desk, Coleman stopped abruptly. "All right," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at Lopez. "Let's get this over with." Lopez stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Derek, we need to check his fingerprints before we file anything." Coleman scoffed, shaking his head. "You're kidding, right? He's just playing us. No ID, no answers. You really think he's clean?" "I think we owe it to the process," Lopez replied, her tone steady. "We can't just assume." Coleman exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "This guy's been playing games since the park. He's got an angle, I'm telling you." The man stood silently, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His calmness grated on Coleman's nerves, but Lopez seemed unaffected. She nodded to the officer at the desk. "Let's run his prints." The officer hesitated, glancing at Coleman, who gave a reluctant nod. "Fine," Coleman muttered, crossing his arms, "but when this comes back blank, I'm booking him." The man stepped forward, placing his hands on the scanner without protest. His expression remained unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, resolve perhaps, or a quiet anticipation. As the officer processed the fingerprints, the tension in the room thickened. Coleman paced nearby, muttering under his breath. "This is a waste of time," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's just stalling." Lopez shot him a look. "Or maybe we're about to find out something we didn't expect." The officer behind the desk frowned at the screen. "It's running," he said, his voice neutral, but the words seemed to echo in the room. Each passing second felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Coleman stopped pacing, his arms still crossed tightly. "What's the hold-up?" he snapped. The officer glanced up, his brow furrowed. "It's not a hold-up, it's—" He paused, his eyes widening slightly as he leaned closer to the screen. "Wait a second." Lopez stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What is it?" The officer straightened, his face pale. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Coleman's irritation turned to confusion as he approached the desk, leaning over to look at the screen. His eyes scanned the results, and for the first time that night, his confidence faltered. This has to be a mistake," he stammered, his voice tinged with disbelief. Lopez glanced at the screen, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. The room fell silent, the gravity of the revelation sinking in. The man remained where he stood, his calm expression unchanged. He met Coleman's stunned gaze and said softly, "Are you ready to listen now?" The silence in the room was deafening. Coleman stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the name. Displayed alongside the fingerprint match, Barack Hussein Obama II. The words seemed unreal, like a glitch in the system. He blinked, his mind struggling to reconcile the name with the man standing quietly before him. This can't be." "Right," Coleman muttered, shaking his head. He turned to the officer at the desk. "Run it again." The officer hesitated, his own disbelief evident. "It's not a mistake, Derek," Lopez said, her voice quieter now but firm. "The system doesn't lie." Coleman stepped back, his face pale. "Barack Obama? No way. This guy, he's a con artist, just like I said." "There's no way." The man, Barack Obama, lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I understand it's difficult to believe, officer," he said, his voice calm, but with a weight that commanded the room's attention. "But sometimes what we assume to be impossible is simply uncomfortable truth." Coleman opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night. The man's calm demeanor, his measured responses, his refusal to be intimidated, all of it now took on a different meaning. Shame began to creep in, uninvited and unavoidable. Lopez, standing beside Coleman, exhaled slowly. "Sir, Mr. President," she began, her voice tentative. "Why? Why didn't you just tell us who you were?" Obama's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Would you have believed me?" he asked, looking between her and Coleman. "Or would you have assumed I was lying, as you just did?" The eyed-up weight of his words landed heavily in the room. Coleman's shoulders sagged slightly, his earlier confidence replaced with a quiet unease. He turned to Lopez, his voice low. This doesn't make sense. Why would he—" "I stepped away from the spotlight," Obama interrupted, his tone carrying both weariness and resolve. "To understand what it feels like to be invisible, to live in a society where assumptions define your worth. Tonight was enlightening." The room grew even quieter, the officers and staff present now realizing the gravity of what was happening. Someone outside the room must have overheard, as whispers began to ripple through the station. "Barack Obama? Here? In custody?" Coleman's head snapped up as he heard his colleagues murmuring. He glanced toward the entrance and saw a few officers peeking into the room, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. The crowd outside had dispersed, but inside the station, a new audience was forming. "Why?" Coleman asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Why would you put yourself through this?" Obama's gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. "Because I wanted to see what's changed and what hasn't. Because stories like mine tonight happen every day to people who don't have the luxury of being recognized. And because," he paused, his eyes locking onto Coleman's, "the only way to fix a broken system is to experience its cracks firsthand." Coleman swallowed hard, his chest tightening as the enormity of his actions sunk in. Every sharp word, every dismissive glance, every assumption he'd made that night now felt heavier than he could bear. He looked at Lopez, searching for something. An excuse, a lifeline, but found none. Her expression was calm but unrelenting, the faintest flicker of disappointment visible in her eyes. The murmurs from the station grew louder as officers began piecing together what was happening. A younger officer leaned toward his partner. "Is this for real? The guy's actually Obama?" "Guess so," the partner replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Coleman's the one who brought him in." Coleman flinched at the words, the shame he'd been holding at bay now threatening to overwhelm him. He turned back to Obama, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Obama raised a hand, stopping him again. "You didn't know," he said evenly. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't ask, you assumed." The room fell silent again, the weight of Obama's words sinking into every corner. Officers who had been curious moments ago now stood frozen, grappling with their own complicity in a system that allowed such assumptions to thrive. Lopez stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Mr. President, I'm sorry for what happened tonight." Obama turned to her, his expression softening. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "Your actions tonight reminded me that there's always hope, even in the most unlikely places." His words were kind, but their underlying weight hung in the air, a stark reminder of the night's lessons. As the realization of the man's identity spread through the station, so did a quiet sense of reckoning. The room remained hushed as Obama took a step forward, his presence commanding yet unassuming. His calm gaze swept across the faces of those around him. Coleman, Lopez, the officers at their desks, and the onlookers gathered at the edges of the station. Every eye was on him, and every ear strained to hear what he might say next. Obama took a breath, his voice steady and measured as he began. "What happened tonight isn't just about me. It's about a deeper issue that touches the lives of millions. It's about assumptions, prejudices, and the way we see one another, not for who we are, but for what we appear to be. His words were heavy, deliberate, each one landing with the weight of truth. He looked directly at Coleman, not with anger, but with a piercing honesty. "Officer Coleman, you didn't know who I was. And that's okay. You shouldn't have. To know someone's name, to treat them with respect." Coleman's face reddened, but he didn't look away. Obama's voice softened, but his tone remained firm. "You see, when we strip away titles, appearances, and assumptions, we're left with what truly matters, our shared humanity. But that humanity is often obscured by fear, by biases we inherit or adopt, and by systems that perpetuate division." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Lopez folded her arms, her eyes fixed on Obama, while Coleman shifted uncomfortably, but remained rooted in place. Obama continued, his voice steady, but now carrying a more personal tone. "I've spent much of my life in the public eye, shouldering responsibilities I was proud to carry. But when I stepped away from the presidency, I realized there was so much I hadn't seen, so many stories I hadn't truly understood. I chose to step back, to walk among the people I once led, not as Barack Obama, former president, but as a man trying to understand the struggles of ordinary citizens." His gaze swept across the room, pausing on the younger officers and staff, who hung on his every word. "Tonight, I sat on a bench in the rain, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel what so many others feel every day. Invisible, judged, assumed to be less." The man's calm yet poignant words drew a collective pause. The room seemed to hold its breath, the gravity of his experiences settling over everyone like a weighted blanket. Obama's voice grew firmer. "The problem is bigger than you, officer. Coleman, it's bigger than me. It's a system that teaches us to see the world in narrow, often harmful ways. It's the unchecked power of assumptions and the quiet damage they inflict on lives that go unseen." He paused, allowing his words to linger. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with reflection and, for some, discomfort. Coleman's shoulders sagged slightly, the burden of his actions pressing down on him in a way he couldn't shake. "And yet," Obama said, his tone softening again, "there is hope. Hope that comes from moments like this, moments where we are forced to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." Lopez, standing just behind Coleman, spoke up softly, almost to herself. "Truth can change things," she murmured, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Obama nodded, his gaze shifting to her. "Exactly. Truth isn't easy, but it's necessary. And change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from moments like this, where people choose to see each other differently." He turned back to Coleman, his expression not accusatory, but understanding. "Officer Coleman, I don't hold anger toward you, but I do hope you'll think about tonight, not just about what you did, but why you did it. Change starts with asking the hard questions." Coleman swallowed, his throat dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded, a small but genuine gesture of acknowledgement. Around the room, the onlookers seemed to shift, their postures softening, their expressions less defensive. Some looked at Coleman with new eyes, while others turned to each other, quietly murmuring thoughts they couldn't yet articulate. Obama took a step back, folding his hands in front of him. His voice, though quieter now, still carried strength. "We can be better. We have to be better. Not because it's easy, but because it's right." The room remained silent for a long moment. The weight of what had been said settled over everyone, filling the space with an atmosphere of quiet reflection. Even the faint hum of the light seemed to fade into the background, eclipsed by the significance of the moment. Finally, Lopez broke the silence. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "for your patience, for reminding us what this uniform is supposed to stand for." Obama offered her a small smile, a flicker of warmth in his otherwise serious demeanor. "It's never too late to remember," he said, "or to change." His words lingered in the air as the room slowly returned to motion. Some officers exchanged glances, others retreated to their desks, but the energy had shifted. It wasn't just another night at the station anymore. It was a night none of them would forget. Coleman stood rooted in place, the room buzzing faintly around him as Obama's words replayed in his mind. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his fingers twitching as if unsure of what to do. The guilt he'd been trying to push aside all evening was now impossible to ignore, its weight settling heavily on his chest. He replayed every moment from the park, the way he'd approached the man with suspicion, the sharpness in his tone, the way he dismissed Lopez's attempts to intervene. Each memory now felt like a glaring indictment, a reminder of how quickly he'd let assumptions guide his actions. What had he seen when he first approached the man? A threat, a nuisance. He had never considered that there might be a story behind the tattered blanket, the calm demeanor. He'd simply seen what he wanted to see, a problem to be removed, not a person worth understanding. The realization twisted in his gut like a knife. His breathing felt shallow as the enormity of his mistake sank in. He had not just misjudged someone, he had misjudged Barack Obama. The irony wasn't lost on him, and yet it wasn't the man's fame that gnawed at him. It was the realization that his actions would have been the same if it had been anyone else. The truth stung. His bias wasn't about this one man. It was part of who he had become. Lopez's voice broke through his thoughts, though he barely registered the words. She was thanking Obama, acknowledging his patience and wisdom. Her steady demeanor only deepened the ache inside him. She had seen what he hadn't, the humanity in the man he had tried to diminish. Her quiet courage stood in sharp contrast to his rigid authority, and for the first time Coleman felt ashamed of the badge he wore. He glanced at Lopez, hoping for some reassurance, but her focus remained on Obama. The respect in her eyes was unmistakable, and Coleman realized she had lost faith in him, if only a little. The thought was almost too much to bear. Obama's voice echoed in his mind. "Change starts with asking the hard questions." The words weren't accusatory, but they felt personal, directed at the part of him he'd avoided confronting for years. He had prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules and kept order. But now he saw how easily those rules could be twisted, how order could become oppression. His throat tightened as he looked back at Obama, who stood calmly, his presence unshaken. Coleman wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Apologies felt hollow, excuses even worse. What could he say to undo the damage he'd done, not just tonight, but in all the moments like this that had come before? "Officer Coleman." Obama's voice was quiet but firm, drawing Coleman's gaze. "You have a choice to make. You can let tonight be another moment you bury, or you can let it be the moment things begin to change." The words struck a chord, reverberating through him. Change. The idea felt daunting, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. His pride resisted, but a quieter, deeper part of him, a part he hadn't listened to in years, wanted to try. Coleman lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can fix this." Obama's expression softened, though his tone remained steady. "The first step isn't fixing what's broken. It's admitting there's something to fix." The room around them seemed to fade as Coleman stood there, grappling with himself. The guilt didn't vanish, but it no longer felt like a weight he had to carry alone. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, the desire to be better. The station felt impossibly still, as if everyone had collectively stopped breathing. Coleman stood there, his thoughts a whirlwind, but his body motionless. The weight of Obama's words lingered in the air, pressing down on him with a force he couldn't ignore. Around him, officers and staff watched in silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief, shame, and quiet reflection. For a long moment, Coleman didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, he stepped forward. His eyes met Obama's, and for the first time that night, they were devoid of the defensiveness and authority he had clung to. What replaced them was harder to define. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the first flickers of humility. "Mr. Obama," Coleman began, his voice rough and strained, I was wrong. About you. About tonight. About a lot of things." He swallowed hard, his words faltering as he searched for the right ones. "I made assumptions. I let those assumptions dictate my actions, and for that, I'm sorry." The apology was quiet but sincere, the words heavy with the weight of what they meant. A few gasps broke the silence, subtle but audible enough to mark the significance of the moment. Lopez, standing nearby, allowed herself the faintest of nods, her expression a blend of relief and hope. Obama regarded Coleman for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step," he said softly. "What you do next is what matters." The station remained silent, the significance of the exchange sinking in for everyone present. Officers who had been skeptical now looked contemplative, their earlier judgments overshadowed by the gravity of what had unfolded. Some exchanged glances, their postures shifting as if unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. Lopez spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We've all got work to do," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This isn't just about one night or one mistake. It's about all of us, how we think, how we act, and what we're willing to change." Her words struck a chord, drawing hesitant nods from a few of the officers. Even those who had initially dismissed the situation seemed to be reconsidering their stance, their expressions marked by a quiet introspection. Obama turned his attention back to the room, his voice carrying a sense of calm but firm resolve. "Moments like this can define us, individually and as a community. The question is, will we let them pass, or will we use them to move forward?" Coleman lowered his head, the sting of shame still fresh, but something else stirred within him. Now, the faintest glimmer of determination. "I'll do better," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The words felt small, but they carried a promise that only he could fulfill. As Obama stepped back, the station began to shift. Conversations resumed, quieter and more measured than before. Officers returned to their desks, but their movements were slower, more deliberate. The tension that had filled the room didn't dissipate completely. It lingered, a reminder of the night's events and what they meant. Outside the station, the rain began to let up, the patter against the windows softening into a faint drizzle. The atmosphere in the room remained charged, but beneath the weight of the night there was a fragile sense of hope. Change wouldn't come easily, but for the first time, it felt possible. Moments of transformation often arise in the most unexpected circumstances, challenging deeply held beliefs and opening the door to change. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where someone's perspective shifted entirely, altering their actions or worldview? What sparked that change, and what impact did it have? Share your story with us in the comments. We'd love to hear how moments like these have shaped your journey. The station was quieter now, the initial shock of the night giving way to murmurs of contemplation and whispered discussions. Barack Obama stood near the processing desk, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. His expression was thoughtful, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just hours earlier. An officer approached hesitantly. "Mr. Obama, given the circumstances, would you like to press charges?" Obama turned to him, shaking his head gently. "No, I won't be pressing charges," he said, his voice steady and firm. Punishment isn't the answer here. What we need is understanding, reflection, and a commitment to do better. The response sparked a ripple of surprise through the room. Coleman, standing nearby, looked up sharply. You're letting this go?" he asked, his tone incredulous but tinged with relief. Obama met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Letting this go isn't the right way to frame it, Officer Coleman. Accountability matters, but it doesn't have to come through retaliation. This moment isn't about me. It's about what we all can learn from it." His words hung in the air, and Lopez nodded subtly, as if affirming his perspective. The officers and staff nearby seemed to pause, their movements slower, their expressions introspective. Outside the station, the media had gathered in force. Camera crews and reporters crowded the entrance, their voices carrying inside as they speculated on what had transpired. The revelation of Obama's identity had spread like wildfire, sparking public outrage and disbelief. Social media was ablaze with clips from the park, shared by bystanders who had recorded the confrontation. Headlines screamed phrases like "Barack Obama detained in shocking incident" and "Former president faces profiling." An officer peered outside the window, his shoulders tense. "The media's not going anywhere," he muttered to his colleague. Obama seemed unfazed. "Let them talk," he said calmly. "This isn't a story about me. It's a story about the bigger picture, about how we treat people and what needs to change." Lopez stepped forward, her voice careful but strong. "The media frenzy is a reaction, but it can be an opportunity too. People are paying attention now, and maybe that's what we need." Obama nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, as if considering the weight of her words. "The attention is inevitable," he said finally, "but it's not enough to shine a light on the problem. We need to keep the light on long enough to fix it." Outside, the crowd continued to swell, voices rising, as cameras clicked and microphones thrust forward. Inside, however, a sense of quiet resolve settled over the room. Obama's refusal to retaliate hadn't just diffused the tension, it had reframed it, turning the night's events into a chance for reflection and perhaps the start of something bigger. "Justice isn't about punishment," Obama said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about building a world where we don't have to ask for it." His words resonated deeply, leaving a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but contemplative, a silence that carried the weight of both the past and the hope for what could. Come next. The press conference room at the station was packed, a sea of reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. Officer Derek Coleman stood behind the podium, his usually confident demeanor replaced with visible unease. To his right stood Lopez, her presence quiet but resolute, and a few steps back, Barack Obama observed silently, his expression neutral, but attentive. Coleman gripped the edges of the podium, the microphones before him amplifying his shaky breath. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Good evening," he began, his voice cracking slightly. I want to start by saying I was wrong." The room went still, the journalists pausing mid-note. Coleman looked up, his face a mixture of shame and determination. "Last night I acted on assumptions. I let my biases cloud my judgment and failed to treat a man, a human being, with the respect and dignity he deserved. For that, I owe Mr. Obama an apology. But more than that, I owe an apology to the community I serve." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I've spent years wearing this badge, believing I was upholding the law, but I realize now that following the law isn't enough. There's a deeper responsibility that comes with this uniform, to question our biases, to recognize the humanity in everyone, and to ensure that justice is not just a word, but an action." Lopez glanced at him, her expression softening slightly, as if silently encouraging him to continue. Coleman straightened, finding steadiness in his voice. In the coming weeks, I will be enrolling in anti-bias training and working closely with my department to ensure that these programs are implemented across the force. This isn't just about me. It's about creating a culture where officers are held accountable and the people we serve are treated with fairness and respect. The flashes of cameras intensified as Coleman took a step back from the podium. He hesitated, then turned slightly toward Obama, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," Coleman said again, this time directly to him, "and I promise to do better." Obama stepped forward, placing a hand briefly on Coleman's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried profound meaning. The room erupted with questions, but Coleman didn't respond. He stepped back, leaving the stage with Lopez at his side. His apology, not just words, but the beginning of a commitment to change. The mood in the station shifted in the days following the press conference. Conversations that once skirted around difficult topics now bubbled to the surface, and among them was the growing recognition of Officer Maria Lopez's quiet but pivotal role in the night's events. While Coleman had been the focus of public scrutiny and Obama the face of calm resilience, it was Lopez's voice of reason that had steered the situation away from further escalation. In the break room one afternoon, a group of officers sat together, their usual chatter replaced by a more reflective tone. "You know," one of them said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, "Lopez had a lot of guts standing up to Coleman like that. I don't know if I would have done the same." Another officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She didn't make it about him, though. She just kept asking the right questions, kept pushing for us to see the bigger picture." Lopez herself, sitting a few tables away, overheard the conversation, but didn't interject. She wasn't one for self-congratulation. Instead, she focused on the ripple effect she hoped her actions would inspire. When asked about it later, she would simply say, "It wasn't courage. It was my job, and it should be all of our jobs." But her humility didn't diminish the impact she was having. Younger officers began seeking her out, asking for advice on how to approach difficult situations or handle moments of doubt. "How do you stay so calm?" one rookie asked her after a shift. "I'd freeze up if I were in your shoes." Lopez smiled softly, her voice steady. "It's not about being calm. It's about remembering why we're here, to serve and protect, not judge and assume. If you lead with that, the rest will follow." Her words resonated, sparking quiet conversations across the station. Officers began reflecting on their own behaviors, questioning the biases they had previously ignored. A training session on implicit bias, scheduled weeks before but often dismissed as just another seminar, saw a full room for the first time. Even Coleman, still grappling with his own journey of self-reflection, acknowledged Lopez's influence. "She saw what I didn't," he admitted to a colleague. "And because of that, maybe now I can start to see it too." Lopez's courage wasn't in grand gestures or public speeches. It was in her unwavering commitment to fairness and her quiet insistence that things could and should be better. And her example was changing the station, one conversation at a time. The events of that night rippled far beyond the walls of the station, reaching the heart of the city's divided community. News of Barack Obama's encounter spread quickly, amplified by media coverage and the viral videos captured by bystanders. But what could have been just another fleeting story of injustice turned into a catalyst for meaningful change, thanks to the conversations it sparked. In the weeks that followed, grassroots efforts to address systemic inequalities began to take shape. Local activists organized town halls, inviting residents, police officers, and city officials to discuss issues like racial profiling and the treatment of the homeless. For the first time, these gatherings were packed, not just with those directly affected, but with people from all walks of life who wanted to listen and learn. One evening, A town hall meeting was held at the community center, and it was standing. Room only. A middle-aged woman in the front row stood up to speak. "I used to walk past the encampments and think it wasn't my problem," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But now I see how wrong I was. These people are part of our community, and they deserve our compassion, not our judgment." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Across the room, a young man in a police cadet uniform raised his hand. "I joined the force to make a difference," he said, "hearing what happened that night. It's made me think about the kind of officer I want to be." Efforts to support the homeless grew as well. Churches and community organizations worked together to provide more resources, warm meals, temporary shelters, and job training programs. A local grocery store owner started a Pay It Forward initiative, encouraging customers to donate small amounts at checkout to fund meals for the city's homeless population. Even small acts of kindness began to multiply. A woman stopped by the park one rainy evening, handing out umbrellas to those who had none. "I saw the story about Obama," she said softly. "It made me realize I can do something, even if it's small." The sense of unity wasn't just limited to residents. Police officers, inspired by the changes within their own station, began volunteering at food drives and joining community outreach programs. Lopez was often at the forefront, but she wasn't alone. Officers who had once dismissed such efforts as not their job now saw them as an essential part of their duty. For the first time in years, the city felt a spark of hope, not because all its problems had been solved, but because people were finally coming together to try. The city awoke to a calm morning, the rain clouds having drifted away overnight. At the park where the events had unfolded, the bench sat empty, save for a small bouquet of flowers someone had left there, a silent acknowledgement of the night. That had changed so much. Barack Obama walked quietly through the streets, his presence unnoticed by most. He wasn't seeking recognition or applause. His purpose had never been about making headlines. Instead, it was about the subtle shifts, the seeds of change planted in the hearts of those who had witnessed or heard his story. As he approached the train station, a young man ran up to him, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Obama," he said, holding out a small notepad and pen, "can I have your autograph? My mom told me what happened. She said you taught people to see differently." Obama paused, offering the young man a warm smile. "Your mom sounds wise," he said, signing the page with care. "Remember, seeing differently isn't enough. Acting on what you see, that's what makes the difference." The boy nodded, clutching the notepad as Obama turned and boarded his train. He chose a window seat, watching the city fade into the distance as the train picked up speed. A faint smile lingered on his face, not one of triumph, but of quiet hope. Back in the city, conversations continued, actions multiplied, and people began to rethink the ways they treated one another. The legacy of that night didn't lie in headlines or viral videos, but in the subtle, enduring shifts it had inspired. A reminder that even the smallest acts of understanding could ripple outward, creating change. Confronting personal biases can be one of the most difficult, yet transformative experiences. Do you believe people are capable of genuine change when they're forced to face the realities of their prejudices? What do you think it takes for someone to truly shift their perspective and behavior? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We'd love to hear your insights on this important topic. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking tales and let us know where you're watching from.